To say Iraq has had a troubled history would be an understatement. Every year you hear news of an attack and the continuation of a civil war there. But why? Didn't the USA invade and create the most stable, free, happy, peaceful Iraq in its history in the world ever? No. The problem was that it made the situation much worse. And to understand that, you need to know where Iraq is located so that you can know which countries influenced Iraq and what sort of government governed Iraq back then. You see, Iraq, located practically in the middle of the Middle East, is at the crossroads of the various different regions of the world which has shaped Iraq, with the Arab world, which Iraq is a part of, to its south and west, Turkish influence to its north, which Iraq is kind of a part of, as many of its predominantly Kurdish population live up in Turkey in northern Iraq, and so share many of the same traditions. And Persia to its east, which again Iraq is influenced by, as although most Iraqis are Muslim, connecting them with both its Turkish and Arab neighbours again, most Iraqis actually follow the Shia branch of Islam, connecting them religious-wise more with its eastern Persian neighbour Iran than Turkey and the surrounding Arab countries. With this in mind, we need to go back in history to early 2003. At the time, the country was ruled by the Ba'athist Party, an Arab nationalist socialist political party. This was the only political party at the time, and its leader, Saddam Hussein, ruled the country as a dictator ever since 1979 officially. Although that year, President George Bush Jr. accused Saddam of aiding terrorism and playing a role in the 9/11 attacks on the United States, along with hosting nuclear weapons. He was a danger to world peace in the US's eyes. And so he gave Saddam this ultimatum.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
The dictator ignored the message, and so the US, with the help of other countries and the Kurds in northern Iraq, invaded and quickly toppled Saddam's regime. Now, after the US conquered Iraq, it would make a series of fatal decisions that would work against it in the long run. Meanwhile, many Iraqis, angry at the US for what they saw as occupying their country longer than necessary, they felt, began to form small militia groups seeking to drive out the US and, in their eyes, liberate it. And this is where the conflict got serious. Radical terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, based mainly in Afghanistan, decided to send troops to Iraq to take advantage of the conflict. This was done because the terror group wanted to start another front in their war with the US that the group was waging. The US at the time was too busy disintegrating the Iraqi military to notice, believing a fresh start for the Iraqi people would be to have a brand new military and government free of Ba'athist influence. So many of these small groups exploded as thousands of angry, unemployed Iraqis who had military training flocked to these now large groups to fight the US. The country now descended into civil war. Many of these groups began to split apart and fight each other as former generals and warlords seek to rule Iraq for themselves. The US then decides to hand most of the previous government jobs to the majority Shia population, angering many Sunnis. And so this caused much of the fighting to get even worse, as Iraq became now even more split because of their different interpretations of Islam, with the Iraqi government, which had been installed by the US, supporting the majority Shia population, causing disillusionment among the sizable minority of the Sunni population. With the US and their new government, they now largely no longer saw the US as neutral on the Sunni-Shia divide. Seeing all this chaos, the Kurds in northern Iraq, who had suffered heavily under Saddam themselves, and had never really saw themselves as Iraqi anyway, started to form their own militias which didn't attack the US, but rather all these government Shia militia groups and Sunni ones that wanted to absorb them back into Iraq. This alienated the surrounding countries, as they all had their own sizable Kurdish populations within their respective countries, and felt that if the Kurds in Iraq could establish independence, then Kurds within their own countries could either unite with them or form their own Kurdish nations. This would obviously weaken them. Across Iraq's border, another country was descending into armed conflict. In 2011, across the border in Syria, the country descended into civil war as its president, Bashar al-Assad, decided not to resign, instead intending to crush the rebels by force, and Al-Qaeda now had a new country it could exploit and fight another war in. That same year, the last American troops leave Iraq, and now the Iraqi army is alone fighting all these groups. Meanwhile, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, an Islamic terrorist, rose through Al-Qaeda's ranks, eventually becoming the leader of a small army, which carried out attacks mainly against the Shia-dominated Iraqi government, but sometimes on the Kurds and even other Sunni groups. However, After some disagreements with some of the higher-ups within Al-Qaeda over strategy, they mainly wanted him to fight in Iraq only, Baghdadi decides to disobey his higher-ups and to also fight in Syria, and after being condemned for doing this, he would decide to make his own terror group using Al-Qaeda's troops to do this. The group he founded was called ISIL, or ISIS, meaning the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This group would expand rapidly across Syria before and also invading large parts of Iraq. ISIS was so successful back then because of a combination of factors. Firstly, remember that large minority of Sunnis that felt marginalised by their Shia government? Yeah, well, many of those Sunnis joined ISIS while others mainly did little to oppose them. Another reason was that there were no longer any foreign troops to stop them, only fellow Iraqis, of whom many of which sympathised with them, as many even in the new Iraqi army were Sunni and felt that ISIS offered a purpose, would end the oppression of them, and would offer stability. Only to discover that definitely wasn't the case. However, the main factor that terrified the Iraqi army was the most brutal ways they killed their enemy. Most of their enemy also knew the terrain well, and so were well coordinated, as most of these ISIS soldiers had grown up in that area before joining the terrorist group, whereas the Iraqi army was ill coordinated, had little experience as it was a relatively new army, and was poorly motivated. This was seen clearly in the 2014 Battle of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. A combined force of just over 60,000 police and army personnel garrisoned the city, but when a force of just over 1,500 ISIS troops attacked, most fled or were taken as prisoner and then executed. ISIS's rapid success alarmed the world. This is what made the Iraqi insurgency a truly global conflict, as the world intervened to stop the terrorists. Other countries such as Iran, which had largely been supporting the Shia militia groups indirectly with weapons and supplies, began to intervene directly as ISIS was seen as a massive threat to the country. They did this by sending many of their own soldiers to Iraq to fight ISIS, along with funding the Iraqi government as well to support Iraq, also to increase its influence there. Saudi Arabia, which became increasingly alarmed at its Iranian rival taking over Iraq, decided also to fund and increase weapon supplies for many of the Sunni groups that it had already been supporting, just more discreetly. However, Saudi Arabia cared little about who these many groups actually were, and so ended up arming many that are branches of other terrorist groups such as al-Nusra, and has been alleged to have directly supported ISIS through funds and weapons itself, but obviously the kingdom denies this. Meanwhile, the Kurds, who generally had poor relations with the Iraqi government and occasionally skirmished with them, quickly team up with them to help fight ISIS. However, after heavy fighting, by October 2017, just before ISIS was to be defeated in Iraq, the Iraqi government launched an offensive against the Peshmerga, as both the Peshmerga and the Iraqi government had different views on where the borders of the autonomous region of Kurdistan actually were. They then finished off ISIS and pushed it back into Syria, and then bombed it with Syrian approval. But the reason why the war is still raging on is because of an insurgency. Although most Ba'athist groups have been defeated by 2011, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are very much still alive in Iraq, just in tiny groups, and only control small, rural, underpopulated areas of the country. Terrorist groups such as these will always be here if the Iraqi government doesn't have a presence across the entire country and provides for its citizens effectively. That's basically the conflict. Shia pro-government militia groups backed by mainly Iran and the wider Iraqi government versus ISIS, Al-Qaeda terrorists versus Sunni militia groups, of which many are extremists that are fighting against the Iraqi government loosely with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are backed by Saudi Arabia. These two countries very much want to dominate the Middle East, and I hope to explore this further with maybe a separate video on it if people want it. I hope you found this video informative and interesting. If you are interested in what's going on across Iraq's border in Syria, you can check out my Syrian Civil War video explained I did on the 10th anniversary of the conflict back in March of this year. Or if you want to know my explanation on the Israel/Palestine conflict, you will see the video any second now come up. And subscribe if you want more videos like these and want a notification to pop up when they come out. Finally, if you have any other suggestions for future videos, please feel free to tell me down below in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching this video.